On November 10, 1932, Kentucky's Martin County Herald carried what seemed to be an unremarkable announcement. The Holy Rollers started a revival Monday night in the schoolhouse at Tomahawk. They have a lady preacher by the name of Skaggs. These are the tongue kind. In less than 3 months, this small Pentecostal church would make international headlines when its pastor John Mills strangled his mother Lucinda in front of the congregation, promising she would rise again in 3 days. In another video on this channel, we document the history of the Pentecostal and charismatic movements and examine the claims of their modern prophets and apostles. Stories like that of John and Lucinda Mills help us to recognize that much of what we see today isn't really new, and it doesn't hold up to biblical scrutiny. The preacher at the 1932 revival was Mary Skaggs. Only 23 years old at the time, she had been a prophetess and evangelist for the Pentecostal Church of Christ since she was 14. She had led their school of prophets when she was only 17. The church claimed to be a restoration of apostolic Christianity in preparation for the imminent return of Jesus. Complete sanctification was said to be confirmed by the speaking in unknown tongues and a return of apostolic gifts of prophecy and healing. Despite the fact that her whole family was in the church, and the denomination's magazine Pentecostal Witness carried promises of health and wealth, when Mary's brother John died at the age of 13, he was the 5th of her siblings to die in their youth. Mary herself would die of pneumonia the year after the Tomahawk revival, never having found healing for her tuberculosis. John Mills had seen his own share of sickness and death with the loss of his young daughter Avenel in 1929. He was drawn into Pentecostalism by William Henry Duty of nearby Paintsville. Between 1896 and 1922, Duty had divorced 4 times and married a 5th time, in addition to receiving a dishonorable discharge from the U.S. Army. But inspired by Mary Skaggs, he had become an evangelist for Pentecostalism. He demonstrated his newfound spiritual power by taking up rattlesnakes during his services and speaking in unknown tongues. Reverend Duty told John that if the Apostle Paul had been unharmed when bitten by a deadly snake, so could anyone, if they just had enough faith. After John attended a few services and had himself spoken in tongues, Reverend Duty told him God had called him to establish a church in Tomahawk. John arranged for rental of the local school and started services. The raw emotion, strange tongues, and modern prophecy stood in stark contrast with the local Baptist church. Just as the Pentecostal Church of Christ newsletter carried stories of water being turned to oil, John and his congregation became convinced that they could turn water into wine. The world may have been in the midst of a Great Depression, but John had found power and purpose. The schoolhouse was soon overflowing, with William Duty regularly coming over from Paintsville and Mary Skaggs coming for revival services. But in December 1932, John discovered 2 men at the schoolhouse playing with the snakes. He was horrified that they were drunk and allowing themselves to be bitten. They laughed and told him the snakes were harmless. Reverend Duty paid them to catch the snakes and cut out the venom sacs. If anyone was bitten, he could pretend to heal them. John realized Duty was a fraud, but he was convinced his experience of Holy Ghost baptism was real. A church split and a fight with Duty got the congregation kicked out of the school. So John and what was left of the congregation started meeting in his brother-in-law's barn. Miraculous healings were claimed, and it was prophesied that John's brother Leonard would soon be released from psychiatric care at the Eastern State Hospital. But the healings didn't seem to last, and Leonard's wife soon received a letter that the doctors intended to keep him indefinitely. On January 29, 1933, John chose to preach on James chapter 1, verse 6.
But let him ask in faith, nothing wavering. For he that wavereth is like a wave of the sea, driven with the wind and tossed. For let not that man think that he shall receive anything of the Lord.
John told his congregation the prophecies and healings were real, but it was their lack of faith that had undermined them. This led all but his extended family to abandon him as a false prophet. John then declared that God had cast out the unbelievers, and those who remained were to fast and to pray until God made clear what demonstration of faith he would require of them. All night they prayed, danced, and spoke in tongues, chanting over and over, "God will free Leonard." After 2 days of this going nonstop, John said they had received a divine command to sacrifice William Duty. 2 of John's brothers-in-law tried to lure him back to Tomahawk, saying they wanted him as their pastor. Duty didn't fall for the ruse, and the group went back to more days of fasting, praying, and reportedly dancing naked around a bonfire. John is then said to have declared that God wanted his nieces sacrificed, but was convinced instead to offer his sister and sister-in-law. He tied them to a makeshift altar and doused them with gasoline. When John was holding the torch to set them ablaze, his sister-in-law objected. John said, "You've ruined it. It has to be a willing sacrifice." His mother Lucinda then volunteered. John promised that God would honor her faith, release Leonard, and raise her up again in 3 days. He then strangled her. Before they could burn her body on the altar, sheriff's deputies arrived and arrested everyone. For all John's sincerity, his mother didn't rise on the 3rd day, and he was no more a true prophet than William Duty. The simple reality is that the biblical prophets and apostles had undeniable miracles to confirm their authority, while modern prophets and apostles don't. God hasn't stopped answering prayer or healing, but the apostolic gifts ended with the deaths of the apostles. Those who claim to be their modern successors are deceivers of others, and sometimes even of themselves. Bill Johnson is the self-described apostle of Bethel Church in Redding, California.
Saturday, just a few days ago, we had a great tragedy. One of the key individuals in our world, their 2-year-old little girl died quite unexpectedly, just out of nowhere. And so we've been praying for the miracle of God. Mom and Dad, Andrew and Callie, have asked us to pray for resurrection. We've joined with them. We have a biblical precedent. Jesus raised the dead. Jesus raised the dead. Not only that, he introduced himself as the resurrection and the life. In fact, in John 11, verse 40, he says, "If you believe, you will see the glory of God." And so seeing what Jesus has accomplished, what he did in his lifetime, and then when you add to that he commanded his followers, his disciples, in Matthew chapter 10, verse 8, to heal the sick, to raise the dead, to cast out devils, to cleanse lepers. None of those are things that we can actually do. And yet he commanded us because somehow in our yes, he gives us the ability to carry out his mission.
For days, the church prayed for Olive's resurrection.
Olive, come out of that grave. Come out of that grave in Jesus' name. Let's go! Olive, come out of that grave. Come out of that grave in Jesus' name.
Lucinda Mills' resurrection never came, and neither did that of Olive. We've included a link to an earnest plea to charismatics in the description of this video. Please watch it to see these issues dealt with at much greater length.